In the second part, we are going to mainly focus on component parameters. We are going to isolate all the things we have done in the previous demo from the other part of the UI, which we are going to do in that section. That's why we are going to need to pass some parameters to our component. And as you can see, we are going to introduce some basic parameters in the UI with the buttons to allow us to change those values. That will reflect how our component from the previous demo will render. Along the way, we are going to focus on such topics as nested components, partial classes, Blazor directives, namespaces, library components, which we are going to use to replace the default rendered buttons from the browser with our custom buttons. And in the end, we are going to talk about component parameters. So let's go back to Visual Studio. Here's our project for today. With it, we have start directory with our rate component from the previous demo, along with the container component, which is new. This is the Blazor component, which just containing the rate component we have done earlier. If we will run that solution right now, it will just render as usual as we saw previously. So what we are going to do, we are here in that component, we will introduce some additional markup to allow us to modify the values for the rate component. We will add parameters for it. For now, we will modify those values from the UI, but after some couple of demos, we will going to remove that part and replace it with the data from the API. We have this new file that will wrap our current work, so it will only provide the inputs for us to select from, but the rate component itself will take no part in that, so we would like our control to be separated from the rate component. We will introduce such controls like selecting the number of icons that will mean the max rate for us, and the shape of the icons itself. So let us get back to it. At the beginning, we will just add some code block with the values that will allow us to store the needed values, which we are going to modify. Let's just add a list of icons that will be allowed for us to select from, and we will introduce some basic markup to allow us the selection. This is the very basic markup. It will introduce some buttons for decreasing and increasing values for the max rate, and decreasing and increasing values for the icon index, which will in turn will return some value, some class value from that array. That array, of course, consists only the classes that are valid from the font awesome library perspective. Let's run that demo. If we will go to our second tile in our application, we will see that, well, firstly, we'll see that we have generated some more markup that we initially wanted. But secondly, we will see that we have successfully rendered all of our buttons. Well, actually currently stylus buttons, but those buttons are working fine. On each click I can change the displayed values, but of course we can see immediately that those values are not reflected in either of those components as they should be. Yeah, as we can see in that example, which is final what we are going to want to achieve in this demo. So let us go back to Visual Studio, stop the application and fix the first thing. As we can see, we can have two rate components in our markup. That's why we saw 10 stars, not 5 stars as we have expected, as we would expect it. So the simplest solution will be to just remove the one that is not needed. And as we can see, uh, we can refer to our rate component in both ways. We can either put the entire namespace using the fully qualified name, but we can also just type the name of the component. The namespace of that component can also be placed, for example, at the top of the file by using the standard using statement, uh, which allows us to define the namespace that will be used across the entire file. Of course, in that situation, it is not needed, and the Visual Studio is highlighting that fact, so we can delete the using statement. We can delete that because rate component is defined in the same directory as our container component, which is using that rate component, and by default Blazor for each Razor component will render their namespace to be exactly the same as the full name of the assembly, along with the directory structure that that component has. So as long as this rate component and container component is under the start directory, we can use that using statement with this capgemini.net blazor.net component.net demo2.net start namespace. For the next part, we are going to remove those markups for the buttons because we would like to add some more stylings to those, and also after a couple of minutes we will going to reduce that logic inside those delegates for each of the on-click actions. So firstly, let us replace those buttons. I will just going to use the buttons like those ones. Yeah, and here in that example, of course, I need to add some namespace because those minus n plus icons are not in the same directory as we presented earlier. So I will add the using statements on the top of the file. Here is that using statement with the namespace for those components. And as we can see, Visual Studio now is able to recognize those components. What we essentially achieved is just adding, we just add some additional stylings for those components. The Razor components are actually a part of the components Razor components library, which is exactly here. We can add our own by adding new project to our solution, and we are going to look for library, not found, library. We have here Razor class library, which is actually the simple project with nearly nothing inside but the www root directory for our static components and some example of the component which we use in other assemblies. For now, let us delete that Razor class library as we are not going to need that one. And the fact we use Razor component in custom markup, custom HTML markup, all of those actions, all of those events are actually the same, containing the same delegates. So we can safely remove the old markup and run our solution. Moving back to our application, going to our second demo after refreshing the component, we can see our changes. The old buttons are gone. We now have new ones, which is working exactly the same with exactly the same issues we had before because we didn't actually do anything to pass those values to our component. But before that, we're going to modify those buttons a little bit more. We'll just change the style, the color of those buttons. So let's go back to Visual Studio. And of course, as those are our custom Razor components, they are not only binded by the on-click event, we can also provide some additional parameters that was already defined in that Razor component. For example, height, theme, width. We will use theme to actually provide some icon theme we want. So instead of that, let us just copy and paste the using statement that we will need. That's better. And the markup that we are going to copy and paste for each icon Razor components. One goes here. Second here, third, and the fourth one. And now, as one can tell, if we are going to run our solution one more time, after refreshing our page, we will see that the default styling for our buttons had changed. And lastly, we are going to do something with those parameters. We want to pass them into that component, the trade component, this in the same manner as shown here. So lastly, let us go back to our Visual Studio. Let's go to the rate component. We will finally add those parameters to that file. Go to rate component.razor. and at the beginning of that code block we will add those properties. Both are marked as parameters. That attribute allows us to define those parameters, the values for those parameters in the markup. So as we can see, we already have those max rate and icon. We can choose any of those and add those parameters like this. Yes, so now if we are going to change the max rate by using either minus or plus icon, or the icon index using the same set of buttons, those changed values will be passed to the max rate and icon parameters, icon rate component properties that we have defined here. Of course, in order to reflect those changes, we will need to replace the for each loop with that one. So I replaced 5 with max rate parameter. And of course, we will need to change this active style, I mean plus value, with the calculated one, like here. So I replaced fixed fast star icon with the icon from the parameter. So let us run this for the last time. And after going to our application, after refreshing it, after each recompilation, going to the second tile, we can see that our solution is currently working along with all the features implemented in the previous demo, as expected in the final component. So we can check all of those points because they are done. Lastly, it is worth mentioning that those component parameters are properties with initializers, so they can take some default values. So if we would leave our component like that, those parameters will be set, but they will have the default values always, regardless of which values we would like to set in the container component Blazor file. So that's it for the demo 2. Let us go further to demo number 3.